Greatest headlines of the century. Dateline, Dayton, Tennessee, July 11th, 1925. In a moment, the story. Charles Darwin's theory that all mankind had descended from a common ancestor, a so-called missing link, had set off the fireworks. John T. Scopes, a Dayton biology teacher, had decided to test a new Tennessee law that forbade the teaching of any theory that denied the divine creation of man. He deliberately read Darwin's theory of evolution to his high school class, complete with drawings and all details. And just as deliberately, he was arrested and indicted. Then the whole nation jumped in with both feet. The great commoner, William Jennings Bryan, let out a roar like a wounded bull elephant. From his semi-retirement in Florida, he screamed to the country that he would assist the Attorney General in the prosecution of the heretic Scopes. Having flung down the gauntlet, Bryan smiled for the newsreels and sat down to prepare his brief. But Scopes was not to face the lions without help of his own. Two famous attorneys of the day, Dudley Field Malone and Clarence Darrow, accepted Bryan's challenge and hastened to Dayton to lock horns with the silver-tongued orator. On the day of the trial, a full house of avid spectators from all over the nation filed in to hear the debate. The issue was no longer the innocence or guilt of Scopes, but rather the final death struggle between two basic human philosophies, fundamentalism versus modernism. The upcoming battle had been facetiously dubbed the monkey trial, and the public demonstrations took advantage. The crowd settled back for the titanic struggle of the two famous debaters, and they weren't to be disappointed. Bryan, using his usual emotional appeal, fought the issue in terms of the gospel and scriptures. Darrow, on the other hand, appealed to reason and logical thinking. He knew the importance of the basic issue involved, and he delivered the brilliant logic of the case that he and Dudley Malone had prepared with the sure, firm hand of an experienced defense attorney. The climax of the trial came when Darrow ruthlessly cross-examined Bryan on the witness stand. He proceeded to humiliate his distinguished opponent. After the closing remarks, Judge Ralston charged the jury, and they retired for their deliberations on a verdict. On the day of the announced decision, the two opposing sides waited calmly in the courtroom. The jury foreman, Captain Jack Thompson, delivered the verdict of guilty as charged. John Scopes received the decree of his $100 fine without any outward show of bitterness. 2 years later, the decision was to be reversed in the Appellate Court of Appeals. William Jennings Bryan died 5 days after the end of the famous trial. Although victorious in the courtroom, he and the fundamentalist cause had been destroyed. The encounter in Dayton, Tennessee, had solved the basic struggle of thinking and education in the modern-day world.
Well, there you have it. That is the story of the Scopes trial, according to secular humanism, in 3.5 minutes. What you've just seen is one of the most creative pieces of propaganda that I've ever seen. What the artistic director did was to get original films that were actually shot at the Scopes trial, mix them in with a few extra items to make the story flow in a particular way, and then to create this piece of artistry in the format of a newsreel. And the newsreels were popular in the 1930s and 40s. They were displaced by television. And the individual who created this particular document recognized that the newsreels were finished, and so he collected many, many of them and then put it together in a series of over 200 of these documents, which he called the greatest headlines in history. Now, the timing of this was unique. It was almost, I would say, providential. It was released in 1960. Very few people ever saw it. But it was produced in 60 to look like something out of the 40s based on something that took place in 1925. And in doing this, the timing was astounding. In the same year that this documentary series was made, Hollywood released the movie that we all know and hate so well, Inherit the Wind. And even that was a unique piece of timing. In a video of a show that was broadcast by the Public Broadcasting System, PBS, the Orthodox Jew and film reviewer Michael Medved did a show called Hollywood versus Religion. It was an extension of his earlier book, Hollywood versus America. And in that video, he makes a very important point. He said 1960 was a turning point artistically in Hollywood. In 1959, the biggest blockbuster movie was Ben-Hur. It was to win in 1960 at the Academy Awards, 11 Academy Awards, which set the record and still is tied for first place. It was enormously popular, and it was a huge moneymaker. And Medved's point is, at that time, in 1960, as a follow-up, there was a major shift in Hollywood sensibility. And he used as the example of that shift the movie Inherit the Wind. He also used another movie based on a book out of the 1920s called Elmer Gantry, which was an attack on fundamentalism, the fundamentalism of the revival meetings. And it had been a popular book among humanists in the 1920s, very scathing of Christianity in general, American Christianity. And that movie went on to be popular at the time, and the Academy Award the next year went to Burt Lancaster for that movie. And the point that Medved was making was this was a self-conscious effort to begin to change the perspective of the American people. As he said, the old Hollywood moguls, most of whom were Jewish, understood Protestant America, understood Christian America, made their movies to appeal to that audience, and got very rich. And his point was a new generation of humanists had come up, Jewish in name, but surely not Jewish in terms of confession of faith, nothing orthodox about them. They were liberals, they were humanists. And he said, despite the fact that the money would be made in selling pro-Christian, pro-morality movies, they shifted the framework. They literally, self-consciously began to go after the Christian background of the culture at that time. And Inherit the Wind was one of the two major films of 1960. The interesting thing is this: as you see the end of that documentary, that fake documentary, that newsreel, you get the impression that fundamentalism was finished, completely overwhelmed, that right reason triumphed, and that it did so in the name of Charles Darwin. The fascinating fact of that is that the following year, 1961, was the year in which Morris and Whitcomb's book, The Genesis Flood, appeared. That book was to change the thinking of a generation of Christians. In fact, represented a major break with the inherited position on what we would call fundamentalism and on creationism. It went to a self-conscious six-day creation position, defended it intellectually. It was published by a small publishing house, Presbyterian and Reformed, and that book became Presbyterian and Reformed's first bestseller and remains an extensive seller that has worked in terms of generating money for the company and generating support for six-day creation ever since 1961. So what we find is that in the very year that that fake documentary was created, announcing the overwhelming triumph of Darwinian humanism and reason over fundamentalism, was in fact the high point of the entire period. And there was another issue, another event that took place. In 1960, John D. Rockefeller Jr. died. For 50-some years, he had been the single greatest source of funding of modernist Protestantism. He was known as such. They knew he would fund almost any major activity of what we would call liberal humanism within the churches. He died in what I really think was the the great year of the triumph, the last of the great years of the triumph of the old Protestant modernism. And it began to shift almost immediately after his death. The documentary was based on actual films from the period, and it is overwhelmingly incorrect. And yet, the story that it tells in 3.5 minutes is the story which was handed down to my generation in that period as we went off to college. To the extent that we knew the story of the Scopes trial, that was the story that we knew. And now, 50 years later, I have this opportunity to respond to that film, to that fake documentary, in a sense to set the story straight. Now, I will say that within academic scholarship, what I'm about to present is considered today pretty much acceptable. There's nothing radically new about my presentation of the Scopes trial with respect to those scholars who have devoted serious time and effort to studying the primary source documents of the trial and the era. So the scholars know, the professional historians know the story of the trial, but that story has not yet gotten into the textbooks. And that's where the fight is made, the textbooks. And that was the fight of the Scopes trial. The issue, overwhelmingly, judicially speaking, and I think culturally speaking, was this: who would control the textbooks? Who had the right legally to control it? Who would control how the textbooks would be used in the classroom? That was the fight in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. That fight was settled, legally speaking, in the United States beginning in the mid-1960s. But in terms of the battle that was fought in 1925, it was not clear who was going to win that fight, who was going to have control over the textbooks, and how those textbooks were used in the classroom. That was the fundamental judicial issue. But the battleground essentially went to the humanists because they knew how to frame the debate. And they were effective in framing that debate in such a way that the fundamentalists, the creationists of their day, looked like buffoons and fools. That is the message that you got from that video, and that was the message that the mainstream media of that era presented to the public. And that message stuck, and I believe 85 years later still has stuck in the consciousness of Americans to the extent that they know the story. Those people who have no background in American history, it's clearly the story they've been told. People outside the United States are as ignorant as Americans are ignorant about this story. And it once again shows that if you have control over the media, you have enormous power to shape men's thinking. And it is a grace of God, I believe, that we have YouTube, we have the web, we have DVD production, we have printing technologies available to us now to get the truth out without the control by the gatekeepers. The gatekeepers were in complete control in 1960. They are no longer in control. And that is our great opportunity. There was a showdown in Dayton in July of 1925. And that showdown was like a typical American, fancy, well-promoted event. It was, if you want to know the fundamental language of America, it was the greatest show on earth. It was P.T. Barnum. Self-consciously, it was the greatest show on earth. This was the greatest single publicity stunt in American history. There's nothing that comes close to it. This is not how it is presented in the textbooks, but that is what it was. It was almost literally a circus. And P.T. Barnum would have recognized it as a kind of cultural heir of his work with The Greatest Show on Earth. It was heralded at the time as the trial of the century. Now that's classic American promotion, the trial of the century. The amazing thing is, however, that it was the trial of the century. There is no trial in American history that comes even remotely close to this one in terms of the impact that it had on the thinking of Americans, whether they were Christians or whether they were non-Christians. This event literally can be used as a marker between the older America, which was more self-consciously Christian in its cultural attitudes, and the newer America, the America of the 1920s, which we called at the time the Roaring Twenties, the America of humanism, of the flappers, of the Charleston, of illegal drinking, of the speakeasies, all the stories that you hear about the 1920s, including the gangs and the machine gunnings, all of the movies that you've ever seen, if you have, of the old gangster movies of the 1920s, it was true in America. Now, it wasn't happening day and night, but it really did mark the era, and it differentiated it from everything which had preceded it. And the Scopes trial was the event in which you can mark the transition between the older America and the newer America. And with that in mind, I want to at least set the agenda, set the framework. And what I did, I wanted to make certain that I got into the spirit of the thing, so I have my 1925 official suit on today. Looks like the old ones that you saw in the documentary, and if I had my straw hat, I could wear it, but unfortunately, of course, Americans knew enough in those days. The gentlemen took their hats off when they came into a room, and so I really am a kind of throwback to the old tradition. By the way, the great advantage of a suit like this is that it never goes out of style, because it was not been in style for about 50 years. In 1925, the event was staged, as I will show, and it was an enormously influential event because of what I would like to call the players. Who were the players? The first player was William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was one of the most important men in American history. I would say, without exaggeration, he was the most important man, certainly, in the history of the Democratic Party. And for this reason, in 1896, he came out of nowhere as a 36-year-old public speaker and lawyer as the final speaker at the Democratic National Convention. Now, the Democratic Party had been very conservative. It was a gold standard party. It believed in free trade. It believed in limited government. It believed in low taxes. It was what we would call, by today's standard, a libertarian party. This was the party of Jackson and Jefferson. And in one speech, Bryan transformed that party to be leftist. He transformed it to be what we would call really radical in terms of the positions that he was pushing. He turned it into an anti-gold standard, pro-inflation political party with one speech. No one ever else in American political history has ever given a single speech which you can go back over 100 years later and say he fundamentally changed the society with one speech. Now, he was a fundamentalist. He was a Presbyterian. He was a Presbyterian by default. He was a Presbyterian because he was terrified of water. And he saw a baptism as a youth by a Baptist church that immersed an individual, and he decided he was never going to become a Baptist. Now, his theology was much more allied with traditional fundamentalism than with the old-style Presbyterianism, but he decided to join the Presbyterian church because he wanted to be sprinkled, and that made a certain amount of sense. He got the Democratic Party nomination in 1896. He lost. He got it again in 1900. He lost. He got it again in 1908. He became the first and only man who has ever received the nomination of a major political party 3 times. He was a phenomenal speaker. He toured the country speaking. He was able to make, in today's money, between $300,000 and $400,000 a year with his speaking. His brother was the first master of the political mailing list. The first real political mailing lists were Charles Bryan's mailing lists, and he put it together based on his brother's speaking ability. So important was that mailing list and was that influence that in 1924, less than a year, or just about 1 year before the trial, Charles Bryan was nominated for Vice President of the United States by the Democratic Party. So this was a powerful individual, an influential individual. He was a master orator, as I've said. He was a lawyer by training. There's no question that he knew the law. He was influential in this sense. He'd been Secretary of State, and he resigned. The only Secretary of State that I remember in American history ever to resign in protest, because he saw that America was being taken into World War I, and he resigned in protest. He completely opposed the idea of America as some kind of an empire. So he was a limited government man with respect to foreign policy, but he was a radical politically, no question about it. He was on the left. And so in that respect was not representative of most of the people we would call American fundamentalists. He was an age-day creationist. He was not a 6-day creationist, and that's not surprising because there were none. There were virtually none within the Protestant movement. There was no prominent figure, academic or political, in 1925 who could be said to be a 6-day creationist. The only individual major figure who was at the time was George McCready Price, and Price was not academically certified, although he was a self-taught man, and he was a Seventh-day Adventist. So in terms of the creationist movement, that was the best they had. The rival on the other side was Clarence Darrow. Darrow was an agnostic, self-proclaimed agnostic. He also was a master lawyer. He was a defender of people who normally could not get anything like a fair trial. He did it for money. He was very successful. He took on cases that were incredibly controversial. And in 1924, the year before the trial in Dayton, Tennessee, he had defended 2 boys which probably almost in American history were the most hated people of the, certainly of the era. 2 boys who self-consciously murdered another youth just to do it. This was the famous Leopold and Loeb case. And Darrow was able to get them life imprisonment instead of execution. So he was highly controversial at the time of the Scopes trial. There was even some thought that he was too controversial. But he did take the case, and incredibly, he took it free of charge. It was the only case known that he ever did take it free of charge. He did the work pro bono. He was a radical, and he had actually supported Bryan politically. So you have this peculiar situation in which he had been a supporter of Bryan, and the other major figure on the other side, that is the side of the defense, had been a great fan of Bryan's and in fact had served under him in the State Department. So it was one of those situations where the lawyers were pretty good friends, like lawyers are, and then they go out and they just battle to the death in front of the crowd. They do what they're getting paid for. Now the third figure was the really important figure from the point of view of how the story has been told. That figure was H.L. Mencken. Mencken was probably the most effective writer that America had, of nonfiction writer of the 1920s. The previous year, 1924, he had founded a magazine which became one of the most influential artistic and literary magazines of the 20s, 30s, and into the 40s, the American Mercury. He was well known. He was a brilliant writer, tremendously gifted writer. He was a journalist, but he was basically an essayist. He was a master of the American dialect and language and tradition. His book on the American language is still taken seriously as a piece of scholarship. Self-taught man. He was a real atheist, and he was more than an atheist. He was a disciple of Friedrich Nietzsche, and in fact, he wrote one of the most powerful books explaining Nietzsche's philosophy in 1907. He was not an academic, but he was committed to Nietzsche and Nietzsche's concept of the Superman. He hated democracy. He had no use for politics. And the incarnation of everything that H.L. Mencken hated was William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was a Presbyterian and a Christian. Bryan was a politician, and Bryan, more than any other major public political figure of his era, was totally in favor of democracy. He believed that it was basically Christian. He believed that God had brought it to pass. He was a total Democrat. He believed that the people ought to be able to do whatever they thought they should do with their own money by going into the voting booth and voting for whatever tax proposal or whatever activity that the government was going to do. He believed that the right of the people under the Constitution was inviolate. And he was a great defender of democracy, and it's why they called him the Great Commoner. He was perceived as a man of the common people, and H.L. Mencken self-consciously hated the common people. He also hated anything connected with fundamentalism. He hated the South. Although he was in Baltimore, he hated the South. He hated Southern culture. He called it the Sahara of the Beaux-Arts. He really did not like Southern culture, and so here was this event taking place below the Mason-Dixon line, which in the United States divides the North and South politically and culturally. He didn't like anything that was associated with the South. And he was determined to make this a major cause. So he invented a phrase called the monkey trial. And that phrase still sticks. The Scopes trial is called the monkey trial. He was the man who convinced the original defense lawyers to hire Clarence Darrow. He interceded to get Darrow to do the work. He interceded in terms of planning what took place at the trial itself. He knew from the very beginning that the goal of that trial was to get Bryan. And he said so. He said it had nothing to do with the teacher Scopes. He said this trial is going to get Bryan, and it did. And it even came to the most remarkable aspect of the trial. That is when Darrow convinced Bryan to step onto the witness stand and testify. That idea was Mencken's. At least Mencken claimed that idea. Then he got his paper to send him out to Tennessee to write up the event. Scopes, almost forgotten. He was a first-year coach. He had a degree in science, but he mostly coached. He was a substitute teacher for one period of a couple of weeks in which the biology teacher had been sick. So Scopes came in and he took over the class. He was a substitute teacher. He was a coach who was a substitute teacher. He was a Methodist by background. He was also a very recent graduate of a law school, although he did not stand for the bar. He did not become a lawyer, but he was trained in the law. How did this take place? It took place because some of the guys, the businessmen in the town of Dayton, decided they wanted to have an event. And the event had appeared as an ad in a Chattanooga, Tennessee paper, down where closer to where the urban activity was. Chattanooga was a big city by their standards in that part of the country, in that part of Tennessee. And they had read that the American Civil Liberties Union wanted to get somebody in Tennessee to admit that he had taught Darwinian evolution in the classroom. Now, why was that necessary? Because in March of 1925, a law had been passed by the Tennessee legislature which prohibited any classroom teacher funded by tax money to teach against the Christian doctrine of the origin of man. Now, the law did not say that there could not be evolution taught. There was nothing to be said about the evolution of animals or any other living beings. only with respect to man was it going to be illegal for a teacher in a high school or even what were then called normal colleges, that is, teachers' colleges, to teach against the biblical doctrine of the origin of man. That was the law. And the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, wanted to get a test case. And they had a strategy. And the strategy was pretty smart. They wanted a case they could lose. If they lost the case in a state court, they could then appeal it up the system of courts in the United States to get it finally in front of the Supreme Court of the United States, at which time they believed they could get the Supreme Court to declare that law unconstitutional. That was the strategy. That was a legal strategy. It was a sensible legal strategy. It didn't work, as it turned out, but it was a sensible legal strategy. It was not done effectively for over 40 years thereafter. But at that time, that was the strategy. So they wanted to lose. That was the goal. They wanted a test case. And in fact, they agreed privately to pay the fine. And the fine was anywhere from $100 to $500. Now, in today's money, that would be somewhere around maybe $1,200 up to maybe $6,000. That was the purchasing power at the time. So it was a substantial fine. It was not a killer, but it was what you didn't want to pay. And so one of the fellows in Dayton, a businessman, looked at this and said, well, you know, if we got the trial here, we could put Dayton on the map. This could be a tremendous thing. People would come, see the trial, no question about it. This is what we ought to do. So they went to Scopes. They knew he'd taught some biology, so they went to him. They said, do you want to do it? Well, he initially didn't want to do it, but then he said, well, okay, if you can't get anybody else to do it, I'll do it. I'll be the fall guy here. There was a problem, however. He couldn't actually remember if he'd ever taught evolution. He was in for a substitute period. They looked back, and it looked as though the textbook reading of that period did have to do with the section on man's evolution. But in fact, Scopes couldn't say for sure if he had done that. So the lawyers went to students and primed them to say that he had done it. So it was a setup from the beginning. They went to the ACLU and they said, Scopes is willing to do it. The ACLU took the case, and that was when Mencken intervened to get Darrow. The lawyers came out, Scopes worked with them, the lawyers began working with the students. They got the thing set up for the great trial. Now, the advantage they'd had is that Bryan had volunteered as an out-of-state lawyer, had volunteered to come in under the authority of the Attorney General and to prosecute the case. And his son came and other lawyers came. There were probably half a dozen lawyers on each side. So this became, from his point of view, the ideal opportunity to challenge the right of the defender, to challenge his right to go into the classroom funded by tax money and teach against Christianity when the money had been collected by Christians, or from Christians. He didn't think he had that right. He didn't think Scopes had the right. He wanted to challenge that legal right. And of course the ACLU wanted to challenge it based on freedom of speech. But of course freedom of speech has to do constitutionally with an individual's right to speak out publicly. It doesn't have anything to do, or didn't in 1925, with the freedom of speech to teach as a public servant in a classroom whatever he wanted to teach. And that was the issue. That was the dividing issue. Now the media framed this great event, and here was how it was framed, and is still framed in people's perception of it, as you saw in the video. It is Christianity versus science. Another aspect, though not always stressed, but was certainly stressed at the time, rural ignorance versus urban education. That is really stressed culturally in the movie Inherit the Wind. Then there is fundamentalism versus progress. And then there is the South, the recalcitrant, ignorant South versus the sophisticated North. And that framing of this enormously influential event stuck. We have never gotten the albatross of that initial framing off of our shoulders and from around our necks. That albatross is still with us. The timing of this was important because from 1921 on, Bryan had been publicly calling for this kind of legislation, and it was being seriously considered in over a dozen states. In a couple of cases, northern states, it was not entirely southern states that were considering this kind of ban on the teaching of Darwinian evolution with respect to man's origins. He had been public in his call. He had actually spoken before at least one legislature calling for this kind of legislation. He was the most prominent figure in the United States to be pushing for that legislation. Now, he was not the only one. A lesser-known figure named William Bel Riley was also pushing for that legislation, but Bryan was the nationally known figure. In 1922, the New York Times gave Bryan an opportunity to write an article favoring this legislation. They gave him his chance, and it was a setup. He wrote the article, it appeared in a Sunday paper, and for the next 2 months, he was pilloried. They got scholar after scholar. They got prominent figure from the scientific community. They got everybody with any kind of prestige to go after him, and they went after him in a way with a savagery that we really aren't familiar with today. Now, we understand that in magazines that are ideologically oriented, yeah, you get really strong rhetoric, but you don't get that kind of strong rhetoric in most cases, even today, the kind of rhetoric they used against Bryan in a paper like the New York Times or even the Washington Post. It was just vicious. And they went after him over and over. And the issue was this. No question what the issue was. The issue was the public's right to control the content of the curriculum materials in tax-supported schools. And to a man, these critics said there is no such right, that these are illiterate people. They are not able to read. They are out of the South. They have no understanding of science. They believe, and this was said over and over, they believe in a flat earth. Now, even that was an invention of the 1820s. The whole idea of the flat earth as being prominent in Columbus's time is completely a myth of the modern world. But this is the tar and feathering that they gave to him. So what they did was to set him up completely, and when he volunteered to become a prosecuting attorney, that was the opportunity. They had set him up for at least 3 years to get him in front of a judge. And they finally got him to do it. Was it the trial of the century, as people called it at the time? The media called it the trial of the century. Was it? It was. 200 reporters showed up. That's one estimate. It was the first trial that was ever broadcast in the United States on the radio. They had to string in wires to do it. The estimate on the number of telegraphers varies. One figure says 22 telegraphers came in. Another estimate, widely quoted, 65 telegraphers came in. They were sending out, they estimate, 165,000 words a day on this trial. They had to be doing it day and night. They strung literally thousands of miles of telegraphy wire into this town that was really off the beaten path in order that they could get this information around the world. We know that they came from Europe. They know that reporters came from Australia. This was an international event. Now you've seen films of it. Those films are real. They had at least 2 camera crews. They had to set up a local airport to fly out the films every day of the trial. This was a media event a staged media event like no other in the history of the United States. Nothing like it ever took place before. Nothing like it has ever taken place since that time. It was the strangest trial in American history. They brought them in to the courthouse. Some of the people they knew had volunteered on the jury just so they get a front row seat to see what was going on. And yet, throughout the trial on all of the technical issues, the jury was dismissed. They didn't get to see it. Testimony was written only, and the judge, after a day, dismissed the written testimony, saying it wasn't relevant. The only question was the law. Did he teach it or did he not teach it? So the judge didn't let the jury into the sessions. Scopes never took the stand. And that was good for Scopes, because if he had ever been asked, did you teach evolution, he would have said, I don't remember. And that would have ended the whole trial. So he never took the stand. The result was a kind of standoff. There were powerful statements made on both sides, but it was only on day 7 that the real event that we remember took place. And that event was Darrow convinced Bryan to take the stand. Now, the idea of a lawyer taking the stand under cross-examination is just unheard of. If it ever took place in any other trial in American history, I've not heard of it. Certainly never a trial that important. Bryan was promised he would get to cross-examine Darrow the next day. So he took the bait. He got onto the stand. It was so hot. This was July. There was no air conditioning. Remember 1925. So they went outside the courthouse, and they did it in the public square. This cross-examination took place in front of the whole town. Well, Darrow pilloried Bryan. It wasn't anything to do, or very little to do, about evolution. It was stories out of the Bible. What about Jonah and the whale? Well, who did Cain marry? And in the movie Inherit the Wind, sad to say, those transcripts are accurate. They did not fake that. And they made Bryan, those questions made Bryan look foolish. And he did look foolish. So he was set up to cross-examine Darrow on the day that became the final day of the trial, the 8th day of the trial. So in they came, and the judge says the previous day's testimony was irrelevant, completely irrelevant. Didn't have anything to do with the case. So I'm taking it out of the record. Well, of course, it's not out of the record with either 22 or 65 telegraphers sending the message. With the thing being broadcast back to Chicago, it was in the record. It was in the public record. It wasn't in the trial record. It was in the public record. At that point, Darrow says, then this case can't go on. Your Honor, instruct the jury to bring back a guilty decision. So there would not be a cross-examination, because since the defense attorney had pleaded guilty, that ended all discussion. That ended the final statement. Bryan had worked for weeks on this final presentation, this final statement, and he never got to give it. Not in front of the group, not in front of the judge, not in front of the town. The jury went out. 8 minutes later, jury came back and said, yep, he's guilty, no question about it. And that was what the ACLU wanted in the first place. Now, Bryan had offered to pay the $100 fine, which is what it turned out to be. The judge said, well, it's a $100 fine. So he had to pay the $100, but of course he didn't pay the $100, didn't have to pay the $100, and immediately it was appealed. And it didn't get settled for almost 2 years, appeals courts being as slow as they are. And the appeals court finally looked at the law and they said, wait a minute, there'd been a previous law that said no judge can impose a fine of over $50. The jury has to impose the fine. And the law, as passed, said the minimum fine is $100. Therefore, case dismissed, technicality, the jury didn't impose the fine, the judge did. They threw the case out. They said, if you want to retry it, you can retry it. There was no need to retry it. because the case had been held in the court of public opinion. Now, it did defeat the ACLU's strategy with respect to getting the Supreme Court of the United States to overturn it based on unconstitutionality. They never again found any teacher who was willing to say that he had taught evolution. Mississippi passed a similar law shortly thereafter, and this law, the original law, it's called the Butler Act, the 1925 law, stayed on the books in Tennessee until 1967. But nobody was ever tried, and the interesting thing is the textbook author who had written that book, in which the Darwinian case was made in 1927, rewrote the book, took out the references to man, changed the language, and kept the book in print. And really, in American history, from that point on, there was almost no discussion of evolution. I can remember in high school, in the late 1950s, the evolution textbook did not talk about evolution. It pretty much dropped out of the textbooks. They didn't want to fight. The textbook publishers wanted to sell books. They didn't want bad publicity. And so from the point of view of the public schools of America until the mid-1960s, the creation versus evolution debate simply disappeared. It was not a major issue from that point on. So what changed? 5 days after the trial, on a Sunday, Bryan died. He died after church in the town of Dayton, died in his sleep, and with his death, the American fundamentalist movement was left without a major leader. There was no other figure in American life associated with fundamentalism or with Christian orthodoxy of anything like his reputation or his prominence. And when he died, you can really say, I believe, the heart went out of American fundamentalism, the heart with respect to public fights. They didn't want to do it anymore. They didn't want to fight it anymore. And because of that change of attitude, it took until basically 1961, with the publication of the Genesis Flood, for the Six-Day Creation movement to take root with scholars. It had built up over time very quietly. Henry Morris had published a few things. Little dribbles and drabbles of people came in and said, no, we've got to go with the Six-Day Creation movement. We've got to go into something that is really committed to the six-day position, which was not true in 25 or 35 or 45. It was not true. So it was that change in American life. On the one hand, fundamentalism, the creationists associated with fundamentalism, stopped the public confrontation. And at the same time, the humanists, the evolutionists, also stopped for essentially another generation. And the fight disappeared in terms of the awareness of the general public. So it was, I think, and would like to argue, it was the trial of the century. It was a trial of the century from the point of view of the fundamentalists. It was a trial of the century from the point of view of the humanists and the modern and the evolutionists. And yet, it did not play out in terms of the battles of American life for another generation. And that's the odd aspect of that trial of the century. Everybody knows about it. Everybody looked back to it, and yet in terms of the warfare which that battle represented, there was kind of a truce that was established, and that truce was not broken until about 1968. That, I like to say, is the real story of the Scopes trial.